but I hope this evening to add to the issues ventilated in a recent Channel 4 Dispatches programme to adumbrate the extent to which the tragedy in Somalia, which so many people are now becoming aware of, is another of our government's dirty little secrets. Television viewers were shocked to see the pictures last week about the widespread suffering redolent of 1984 and the Great Famine of that year. The US and Britain immediately pledged $90 million in famine relief. Just 1 week after its appeal to the international community for famine relief, the Ethiopian government increased its military budget by $50 million to $400 million, whose little children, fly-infested, kwashiorkor swollen, famished, famine-stricken children, has been encouraged, armed, trained, financed and otherwise facilitated to invade and occupy its neighbour Somalia and create a reign of terror in that land, which is testified to by this voluminous Amnesty International report, which if I had time I would extensively quote from. Somalia has lost thousands of dead as a result of the Ethiopian invasion. Millions have been displaced. Somalia, under Ethiopian occupation, is the grimmest prison state in Africa. Worse, far worse than Mugabe's Zimbabwe. And who has done the encouraging, the arming, the training, the financing and the facilitating? The same US and British governments who donated the $90 million to the same Ethiopian government which is burning its money and burning the villages, the neighbourhoods and the people of occupied Somalia. This government is never done talking about the shortcomings of African leaders. Just last week in Rome, the Secretary of State for International Development was roaring at Robert Mugabe. Yet there has not been a squeak out of him or any other minister about the much bigger crime in which we are ourselves deeply complicit. Is it any wonder that African opinion considers so much of what we have to say about misgovernance in Africa to be the deepest, most cynical hypocrisy? 2 weeks ago, Channel 4's Dispatches team took terrifying risks to bring us the latest from occupied Mogadishu. It was undoubtedly an award-winning documentary. It was memorable for many reasons, not least the scene in the FCO when the Minister, Lord Malach Brown, his face frozen in horror, was confronted by Adam Hartley, which for those members who didn't see it, I know that the Minister will have seen it. She could hardly be sent out to bat on this wicket without being shown it, was this: that in the grim prison state of occupied Somalia, the fingerprints of our country and our government are all over the scene of the crime. The president of the puppet regime imposed by the Ethiopian army in Somalia turns out to be British. He spends much of his time here. Well, it's dangerous in Somalia after all. He has property here, family here. He presides over a gang of torturers, murderers, grand larceners, extortionists, and then flies back to England. The police chief, whose police officers kidnap people for ransom, which they extort from people living in our own country, in Leicester, in Birmingham, in London. His police officers torture people. They make them disappear. They kill them if their families will not pay. He's British too, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And the former Interior Minister, who presides over an interior of mass refugee camps, starvation and misery, and who stands accused of stealing international aid, of diverting food for political purposes, why, he also is British. And guess what? Who's paying the wages of the murdering, kidnapping, torturing, quizzling police force in Ethiopian occupied Somalia? That's right, we are. The puppet dictatorship in Somalia is a very British crime, especially as our own government, especially the pocket-sized Palmerston, the Secretary of State hitherto referred to, is so very voluble on other problems in Africa. So how did we get here? How did we get into bed with the former pro-Albanian Maoists of the government in Addis Ababa? I'm afraid it's our old friend, our old acquaintance. The policy of my enemy's enemy is my friend. This policy which has put us in so much trouble, from Afghanistan to Iraq and many other parts of the world, is what lies behind this obscene paradox. We are supporting the Ethiopian government's occupation of Somalia because George Bush told us to. Because Somalia is a front line in George Bush's ill-conceived, counterproductive, utterly discredited, about to be booted out in the United States, so-called war on terror. We are against the former government of Somalia because it was an Islamic government. Just as we're against the government in Sudan because it's an Islamic government. Just as Ethiopia on our behalf opposes the government in Eritrea because it's an Islamic government. This policy, having been such a disaster around the world, is now in full force in Somalia. And but for Channel 4's dispatches, hardly anyone in Britain would know anyone about it. No minister has come to the dispatch box to explain why British taxpayers' money is being paid to a police force in Mogadishu, which is accused of kidnapping people and extorting the money for the ransom from British citizens. No British government minister has come to explain, unless one takes Lord Malloch Brown's frozen face as explanation, why we are so heavily involved with a puppet regime bereft of political and public support in Somalia. This policy, Mr. Deputy Speaker, of backing anyone that Bush tells us to, this policy of backing anyone who is against those which we today perceive ourselves to be against, is morally, utterly vacuous, but arguably worse than that. It's not only morally vacuous, it's a total, dismal failure, as we found in Afghanistan, to our bitter, bitter cost, not least this very week. The very mujahids that Mrs. Thatcher's government lauded and supported and armed are now murdering and killing our soldiers in Afghanistan.
Order.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Sir George Galloway.
I had the adjournment debate. It was scheduled to start at 7 o'clock for half an hour. I've now had 10 minutes, and the country, of those interested, watching on Parliament TV, will not hear the Minister even reply.
The honourable gentleman was misunderstood. The adjournment debate is now starting at 7 o'clock. He's so far had bonus time. It's one of the systems we have to go through as far as the House is concerned.
Well, that's truly magnificent, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I have plenty to say. Perhaps I can now quote from Amnesty International in more detail in the time that I didn't think I'd have available. The point is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this policy is not only morally bankrupt, it is also politically disastrous. Afghanistan is the perfect case in point, and Ethiopia, which is presiding, the Ethiopian government presiding over a country where now famine and mass starvation stalks the land, is being helped militarily to invade and occupy its neighbours and threaten other of its neighbours. What can this conceivably do for our standing in Africa? What can this do for our credibility when we lecture the government of Sudan or the government of Zimbabwe? But if our problems on this were confined to Africa, Mr. Deputy Speaker, then that would be bad enough. But it's much, much worse than that. The Somalians are the tallest people on the earth, but they're virtually invisible politically on the international stage and in our own country. But there are hundreds of thousands of Somalians in our country. Hundreds of thousands. Either because they have European Union passports, or because they are refugees from the very fighting which we in part are fueling, and their young people are increasingly furious, bitter, angry, nursing their wrath as they watch on the Somali television and elsewhere on other Muslim channels the carnage in their country. 2 million people in a country of 11 million. That's almost a fifth of the population. If it were our population, it would be 12 million people living as refugees. If you want to scale it up, 2 million refugees inside the country, 1 million refugees in neighbouring countries. God knows how many hundreds of thousands scattered across the European Union. These families, in their bitter exile, are bringing up sons, maybe daughters too, who are bitter and furious at the Western role in the problem that they see rolled out on their television screens in their country. And we, who've just spent how many hours trying to deal with the problem of terrorism, cannot see the connection between this constant policy of infuriating young Muslim boys and girls by the double standards and the injustice of our policy towards their countries and the countries their parents come from. We can't see the connection between the growth of extremism. Government's always looking for a cleric to blame or an organisation to ban for the radicalisation of Muslim youth in Britain. But they don't need a cleric or an organisation to radicalise them, Mr. Deputy Speaker. They just have to watch the news. They just have to watch what our government is doing in Muslim countries like Somalia. Now I want to know from the Minister, because I know that she's seen the Channel 4 Dispatches programme. I know that she's not going to stand up and claim that she didn't see it, even though she's answering a debate on human rights in Somalia in the House this evening. I know that she's seen the programme. So I want to ask her to do a better job than Lord Malach Brown did in explaining why are we paying for from our taxes, taxes that amongst other things could be used to help starving people in Ethiopia, or keep our pensioners warm in the winter, or keep some of our post offices open. As the Minister for Closing Post Offices is by your chair, I hope he's in the House and it's in order for me to refer to him. Money that we could have used for a better purpose is being spent on the security forces in Somalia, which are accused by Amnesty International, as well as by Channel 4, of widespread abuses of human rights, of torture, of murder, of disappearance, of kidnapping, extortion and grand larceny. Why are we allowing the Minister of the Interior of Somalia to travel back and forward into our country unmolested when he's accused by aid agencies of purloining international aid, desperately needed emergency aid for hungry people, for himself and for political purposes, for his political clan? Why isn't the government stopping him at the border, questioning him about where the money went that was put into Somalia and has disappeared? Aid agencies will not set foot by and large now in Somalia. So catastrophic has the situation become. I want to ask the Minister why we're supporting a President, an Interior Minister, a Chief of Police in Somalia, allowing them freely to come and go without answering the charges that are being made against them. When will the government at least condemn the human rights abuses in Somalia? Amnesty International has voluminously recorded them, but not a squeak from the government that's never done roaring at Sudan or Zimbabwe. Why? Because we are deeply complicit in it. Indeed, we are paying for it. We are paying for the security services that are committing these crimes in Somalia. Now, the government may think that because most Somalis in Britain don't have votes, for one reason or another, that tall as they are, they can be ignored. But the truth is, this is a ticking time bomb inside our own country. The loathing from the Somali community in Britain of the actions of our government is a ticking time bomb in Britain. I, if not she, am constantly exposed in my own constituency and in Birmingham and Leicester and other places to the anger of these young Somalis. It's a disaster waiting to happen, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I hope that the Minister will announce today that she will, in the wake of Channel 4's revelations, investigate properly these allegations, and she will report to the House her findings on that matter. The truth is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, our government's foreign policy towards this Horn of Africa, towards Afghanistan, and not just this government, previous British governments too. I sat in the opposition, accusing the then Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, of having opened the gates to the barbarians with her support for the so-called Mujahideen in Afghanistan all those many years ago. Mr. Deputy Speaker, you will perhaps recall it yourself. This policy which our governments have followed, of my enemy's enemy is my friend, is a fatally flawed policy. It's fatally flawed everywhere that it's been tried, and it's now being tried all over again in Somalia. So for the sake of the many Somalis who are watching this, because the word is out in the Somali community about this debate this evening, for the sake of the people on Universal TV and other Somali channels who will show this debate, I hope that the Minister will come clean about the dreadful problems that exist. And I hope she'll say to the Ethiopian government, the Honourable Gentleman wishes to give one.
The Honourable Gentleman giving way. Can I congratulate him on his success in getting this debate this evening? I apologise that I've arrived late, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It caught me slightly unawares. What's best for the Somalian people and Somalia itself, of course, is security. Does the Honourable Gentleman accept that the Ethiopian government are providing security in Somalia at the moment, and they want to withdraw from Somalia at the earliest possible moment? And would he join me in encouraging the United Nations and in Amazon and also the African Union to ensure that troops are put back into Somalia in order to give Somalis that security that they need? Ethiopian troops want to return to Addis Ababa.
Well, I don't accept it. I don't accept it at all, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I know the Ethiopian government rather better, it seems, than the Honourable Gentleman. As I explained before he came in, I knew them when they were pro-Albanian Maoist guerrillas in the TPLF. I knew all their leaders who are now the government ministers. I know that they have no intention of withdrawing from Somalia unless they're forced to. They want to occupy Somalia because they've been paid to do so. And they were paid to do so by the governments of the United States and by our own government. They're doing a job for what they imagine to be the western part of the international community. Well, the Minister for Closing Post Offices laughs, but he has many Somalis in his constituency, as I have in mine, and I hope that the camera caught him laughing. The truth is,
I do apologise for intervening with the Honourable Gentleman. I didn't laugh at anything he's been saying so far.
Well, I'll not go further down that track. Perhaps the camera caught the verisimilitude. The truth is that the Ethiopian government is carrying out a service for the people who give it weapons, for the people who give it money, and for the people who give it diplomatic and political support. They're having a Beano in the Ethiopian embassy next week. Perhaps the Honourable Gentleman is going. He'll certainly get an invitation in the post after his intervention on my speech. They're having a Beano to celebrate the 17th anniversary in the Ethiopian embassy in London of their coming to power. It's going to be a very grand event. This at a time when their own people are starving to death. Their children are starving to death, 120,000 of them, with a month to live, and they're invading and occupying their neighbouring countries. And nobody says boo about it. In fact, far from saying boo, they say, here's some more military and some more financial aid to do it. Because the government of President Bush, utterly discredited on its way out, with virtually nowhere to go except Downing Street on Sunday for one last photo call, regards that the defeat of the former Islamic government in Somalia as part of its war on terror. That's what this is all about. Ethiopia is playing the role of hammer in the Horn of Africa for the United States policy and its war on terror. That's what Ethiopia are doing, and therefore they will not withdraw until a new American government, hopefully with a Kenyan affiliated president, tells them that actually this policy is deeply flawed, because the puppet regime of British citizens imposed on Somalia by the Ethiopian invasion wouldn't last 5 minutes. If the Ethiopian forces withdrew, they'd have to withdraw with it. And so any government that's going to come to power in Somalia in the future will be filled with hatred of Britain and the United States. This is the problem we keep making everywhere. We intervene either to prop up tyrants or to support tyrants because we don't like the tyrants they're fighting against. And then we generate still more problems for ourselves, and we wonder why, and we agonizingly debate anti-terrorism laws. Why so many people in the Muslim world want to hurt us? Why so many young people in the Muslim world are so bitter and angry about us that they want to hurt us? Well, is it any wonder? Can it be any wonder to any sane person? I'm giving way in a second to the Honourable Gentleman. Can it be any wonder it's these kind of policies? I beg the Minister to believe me, because I'm talking to Somalis all the time. The rage felt in the Somali community in Britain and around the world about Britain and America's role in their country is generating a terrorist. Let me spell it out, as the Right Honourable Gentleman who saved the government's bacon earlier this evening is now in his place. Let me spell it out. As we spent so many hours discussing anti-terrorism, we are making new terrorists.